From the WNIN Tri-State Public Media Center in downtown Evansville, I'm David James, and this is 2 Main Street. Well, you may have heard of the Red Tails, the famous Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. The all-black fighter group escorted American bombers as they flew over the Mediterranean Sea and into Nazi-occupied Europe. And these black pilots flew a succession of warplanes, including the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, made in Evansville. There have been several movies about these daring aviators and their crews, their training at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, their aerial combat skills, and yes, the segregation they faced. But did you know about the Tuskegee Airmen in Indiana? I didn't. And the story is told in a new documentary produced by Specify Creative, based in Evansville. The filmmakers are Stephen Whitty and Owen Hollander, and Tuskegee Airmen in Indiana is among the films selected for the annual Hoosier Film Festival. Narrating the film is Reverend Dr. Adrian Brooks, pastor of Evansville's Memorial Baptist Church. Reverend Brooks will join us later, but first, let's meet the filmmakers, Stephen Whitty and Owen Hollander. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Stephen, you're the managing editor of Specify Creative, is that
Managing
correct?
director.
Managing director, okay. Owen, you're a film student now at SCAD.
Yep.
That's correct. That's the Savannah College of Art and Design. So how you guys got together on this project is quite a story in itself. So, Stephen, let's start with you. You were helping a high school student, I understand, with a project, and it was not Owen. And then you decided the Tuskegee Airmen in Indiana was a story worth retelling. Is that correct?
That's exactly it. This high school student from North here in town had come to the Evansville Wartime Museum. I was a volunteer there at the time in charge of design and exhibits. And part of that job was outreach for local colleges, universities, high schools. And he came to us with a senior project request.
Who is this dude?
Caden Gross.
Okay.
And the next step was hearing that he had an interest in World War II aviation and in the Army Air Corps. And somewhere along the line, because, Evansville Wartime is focused on, this area, events at the battlefront or home front in this area. And at some point we found this connection to a month in 1945 when a unit of the Tuskegee Airmen was near Seymour, Indiana.
Now, Owen, you were at Signature School in Evansville researching a documentary on veterans called Never Lose Hope. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so that was my Eagle Scout project, sophomore year of high school, and I originally reached out to the Evansville Wartime Museum as a type of sponsor and a collaborator within the project, and it was the story of 8 veterans ranging from World War II to modern conflicts, just kind of them talking about their military service and the experiences and stories of that, and I got in touch with Stephen, and he helped me kind of executively produce the film, and that's how our filmmaking relationship started from there.
Were these local veterans?
Yeah, they're all local. That I got in touch with them through different connections, and even my own grandfather is in the documentary. And so just kind of my favorite interview was the one of the World War II nurse who was in English hospitals during D-Day and just got a lot of really great stories that even the families hadn't heard of. So it was a really great experience.
Well, tell me about your grandfather.
Yeah, he was in the Navy. And I'm sorry, not the Marines, my bad. And he served in South Carolina and was in the reserves and just had that experience. And one of his craziest stories was he wasn't there when one of his daughters was born, and just kind of getting that experience of being a military man. And so, yeah.
So this was you guys was chance meeting at the Evansville Wartime Museum?
That's right. Like Owen said, he was coming in December of 2019 to talk to us about Never Lose Hope, and I had been asked to sit in on that meeting. Tuskegee had been in the drawer since Caden graduated. We had decided, to make a film as a museum exhibit, but we ran out of time, and so it got shelved. Owen came in to talk about Never Lose Hope, and it sounded like he knew exactly what he wanted to do and how he was going to do it. So we signed off on it and agreed to make Evansville Wartime a home for that production when it was finished.
So we have COVID delays, of course. Owen graduates, then goes to SCAD, but the idea never dies. So when was the film finally finished, guys?
It was finished in February of 2022. I believe we screened it for Pastor Brooks on about the September 16th.
And how long is the film? The Tuskegee Airmen?
14 minutes.
14-minute film, okay. Now let's go back to the story of the Tuskegee Airmen of Indiana. From 1941 to 1946, some 1,000 black servicemen trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama and became the first African-American flying unit in the U.S. military. These pilots were first trained to fly fighter aircraft to escort bombing raids in Europe, and then a unit of the Tuskegee Airmen ended up in southern Indiana to train on a different aircraft. Where in southern Indiana?
They were at Freeman Field, which is near Seymour, and they were training on a B-25. It's a medium-range twin-engine bomber.
And this was going to be used in the attack on Japan, is that
Well, because of the way the racial dynamics of the training program for that unit, they would have deployed to Europe. But the war in Europe concluded before they were combat ready, and actually the war overall ended before they were deployed outside of the country.
But I read where they may have been sent to Japan, in the Pacific Theater.
That would have been a likely destination.
The war in Europe ended in May of 1945.
Correct.
Okay. Now, in southern Indiana, on a different aircraft, things did not go well for these black servicemen in southern Indiana, an understatement. The film highlights the Freeman Field mutiny, so-called mutiny, when black officers tried to enter a white officers-only club. That had to intrigue you, didn't it, Owen?
Yeah, it was very interesting. I think just to hear that story of how these men overcame adversity and were already putting themselves at risk and sacrificing themselves for their country. A line that really stands out to me in the film is when the Nazi prisoners were taking note of how they were being treated back home. And there's the line in the film where it says the Nazis asked them, "Why are you fighting for a country that doesn't want you?" And I think, to me, that's one of the most powerful lines in the film, because it really just adds a great deal of context to what they were going through, but why they still persevered for their cause.
Arrests were made when these officers tried to enter the white-only club. Those black officers became actually prisoners, sent, I think, was it to Fort Knox?
Yeah, there were two phases of that. The first 61 that tried to enter were confined to base at Freeman, and as a result of that, the base commander issued a regulation firmly segregating all of the facilities on the base, separate mess halls, separate recreation, separate quarters, and separate officers' clubs. And he wanted all of the men, all 400 officers of the 477th, to sign that. 101 refused. They were the ones who were loaded up on transports and sent to Godman, placed under arrest in their quarters. And there's more story to that, but that's the two phases of the mutiny.
And that's where they came. The German prisoners were being held.
Yes.
At that same facility, that area. Wow, that's really a twist to this story that's incredible. Now, there was courts-martial. 6 black officers did serve as military judges, and I read where when every white officer, was called to testify, at first they refused to salute the black officers, and that's something too. So what was the outcome of the courts-martial?
Well, there were, after some of the charges were scraped away, General Marshall had ordered the release of the 101, but there were 3 who remained, who were charged with disobeying an order and jostling a superior officer. Of those 3, 2 were acquitted of all charges, and one was, he was apparently the one who was hands-on in the jostling incident. So he was fined, demoted, and then dishonorably discharged.
And was he later reinstated?
I have not found that in the readings.
All right. Now, of course, all this happening during wartime, so that kind of elevates the charge?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It could have been an offense punishable by death. And even for the 101 who were not sent to court-martial, the base commander put a note of reprimand in their permanent file, and it took until 1995 for those to be removed.
Now, Owen, you directed the film. What about the search for archival footage?
Yeah, a lot of that really came from public sources of archival footage and YouTube, and you would be surprised at how much old news broadcasts and old documentary footage that can really resurface from that time. And so just kind of sorting through all of those elements that you find and figuring out how they could be implemented into the film.
Remember, we found that wartime film was Wings for This Man.
Yes.
That was filmed at Tuskegee and narrated by Ronald Reagan.
Really?
So there were a lot of air-to-air shots and training shots around campus that were useful to us.
Yeah, lots of really unique footage of the men driving around in vehicles and flying the planes, and just you can't beat it because it's that authentic, real evidence, and so it's really great.
I know I like to see the Signal Corps productions that they ran in theaters during World War II, highlighting the different units
Yes.
and the training. That'd be a great resource right there.
We do get a lot of questions about where we found that footage, especially the in-cockpit footage in the B-25s.
Some interesting characters in telling the story. Charles Blakely Buster Hall, a native of Brazil, Indiana, and he shot down a German plane?
He was the first Tuskegee Airman to shoot down a German aircraft, that's right. And there's some interesting stories behind that. You know, General Eisenhower flew down to his base in Tunisia, and he brought Jimmy Doolittle with him and some other dignitaries to congratulate him on that. But what we found in the readings was the thing that meant the most to that Tuskegee Airman was the unit had saved their last bottle of Coca-Cola as a high honor for whoever got the first adversarial aircraft. And I think that meant, what I remember reading is that meant more to him than almost anything else.
Was it ice cold?
We can hope.
I hope so. Okay. All right. And I understand there's a statue of Charles Buster Hall at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma.
Right.
And he had a total of 3 kills.
Yes.
During the war. Another character, General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., an important figure in military history, a problem solver, sounds like.
Yes. Well, you know, it's hard to talk about General Benjamin Jr. without talking about General Benjamin Sr., because he was the first black general in the Army as well as any of the U.S. Armed Forces. His son was the second. And Sr. was among the people who helped convince FDR to create an all-black flying unit.
So, guys, why did you want to tell this story?
I think a main reason we wanted to tell this story is because of how important it is to tell and for that story to get out there, because even today, it's still a lot of adversity is faced being today, and it just shows that historic example during wartime of how these people overcame these challenges and how they were really able to persevere and use their bravery to overcome this. And so it was really interesting.
It was really compelling, too, because there was a meeting among the black officers in early April about how to peacefully and non-violently work towards desegregating the White Officers Club. And some of these actions that began in the Tuskegee environment, you know, paved the way not only for integrating the U.S. Air Force when it was created just after the war, but falls in line with a line of civil rights actions that followed after World War II.
Now, the Evansville Wartime Museum, I know you've been involved in that organization. How important is that to this community?
Well, you know, I think it's, as Owen was saying, it's important here. It's a piece it's woven into the fabric of our area's World War II legacy, but it goes beyond that to, you know, social justice and some of the adversarial situations that continue to this day, not just within the military service, but in society.
And there's a P-47 on display now.
Yeah, really great exhibit and just really impressive for the community. That should all get out there and see it, because you can learn so much about your own community. It's not all these big scale events. There's so much that happens on the local level that goes unknown.
And the Tuskegee Airmen flew the Thunderbolt.
They did fly the Thunderbolts for a period of time. They were in P-40s, then the 47s, and then they wound up. I think the iconic aircraft for them is the P-51 Mustang.
And of course, they flew bomber escorts and also strafed a lot of enemy, I understand, installations.
Yes, yes, that's right. Because I believe on the trips back to base, the bombers were released after a certain point, and then the fighters could take on targets of opportunity.
Joining me now is the narrator of the film, Dr. Adrian Brooks, Sr., pastor of Memorial Baptist Church in Evansville. Pastor Brooks, welcome. You did a great job narrating the film.
Thank you.
Did you know anything about the Tuskegee Airmen in Indiana?
I did not. The fact that they had a role here and a presence here in Indiana was an enlightening event to me as well. And I became very excited about it when Owen and Mr. Whitty presented it to me. I mean, and then to give me this opportunity, I must tell you, I am indebted to both of them.
So you were immediately on board.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
There was no hesitation there.
No.
Okay.
No, they along with Rashida Ajabadi, who's part of our memorial staff, and Leah Darton. They worked with Mr. Whitty and Brother Owen and made sure that I was comfortable. And then when Owen and Mr. Whitty, Stephen Whitty, and I met, I mean, we were just so comfortable with each other. So it made it a very fun project for all of us involved.
Well, it's such a great story to tell,
yes,
too. It's got a lot of twists and turns to it.
Good story and two very talented personalities.
Definitely. Now, this was recorded at the church.
Yes.
In the library, was it?
Yes, I have a library there at the church. It's a quiet place that you can go and study. I think we're at over 10,000 volumes of books there, and a lot of African American history books, and so it's a very rich room full of a lot of good information.
Now, of course, you're used to speaking to the public. Is there a different style with narrating this project?
Mr. Whitty helped me and guided me in many ways through that process of finding one's voice for this particular piece of narration, and brought about some ease. And so it was really not a stressful experience. I mean, we were able to get through it pretty without any major stresses, I'll say.
Well, it is really well done. Now, the screening of the film, February 27th, 2022 at your church, and that was the last Sunday of Black History Month.
Yes.
What was that screening like, that first screening?
That was a very rich experience, I think, for the total congregation, for myself as well. I think that Owen and Mr. Whitty were able to observe a predominantly black congregation watching a documentary that depicted a valiant moment in history, where you have these individuals who are combating segregation and discrimination and racism in the places where they live, but they have caught a patriotic bug, and to them, it is important that they not just make a statement, but make a difference. And these gentlemen were able to do that, and Owen and Mr. Whitty were able to capture that in film. So the people saw again the richness of the African American experience, which says that yes, we have these challenges and these obstacles, but it will never rob us of our initiative, of our patriotism, of our valor, and our willingness to die for the country in which we live.
What was the reaction from the congregation?
The congregation was they were enraptured, and I mean everybody was just tuned in, and and then when it ended, you could see the lights. It's like, wow, this is, yeah.
Well, good deal.
It was a very rich experience, I think, for all of us.
Now, these black servicemen who became aviators and mechanics received their training at what was then called Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University.
Yes.
A school started in Macon County, Alabama, after the end of the Civil War. Tell me something about Tuskegee Institute, Reverend Brooks.
So Tuskegee College has produced. I mean, of course, the first principal, the first president was Booker T. Washington. Most of us know Booker T. Washington from the debates that were publicly known between he and Dr. W.B. Du Bois as to what is the best route for these freed African Americans to the path that they needed to take, whether it was education or whether it was a vocational kind of paths. And really, it was not really a debate per se, because there were African Americans who were engaged in both paths, and so but these gentlemen would have these debates. One of the speeches given by Booker T. Washington is the Atlanta Compromise speech, and you've heard that statement: "Cast down your buckets where you are," where he talks about where you are and letting that be very good at what you're doing, and let that become your foundation, and then build on that foundation. So Booker T. Washington will go down in history as one of the great minds in this country. And so when you go to Tuskegee, it's a rich environment. Dr. George Washington Carver, of course, was a professor there, and he developed over 300 byproducts from a peanut. So I mean, that brilliance was there. There's the engineering school, of course. There was the Morton airfield, where the Tuskegee Airmen were.
And the veterinary
training.
school now is very famous.
The veterinary school has put out, I want to say 85% of the African American veterinary veterinarians in this country, something like that. That's a statistic that was thrown out at one time.
Well, I read where this school was really built from the ground up.
Yes, sir.
I mean, people went there and they built the school.
Yes.
I mean, they became tradesmen.
Yes.
And they built all the buildings and everything, and they brought in livestock. They grew their food there.
Yes, sir.
So it was like a kind of a commune at first.
Yes, it's a community.
Self-sufficient.
Yeah, it is a community built on industriousness and pride, and it produced individuals like Dr. Ron Rochon, who is the president of the University of Southern Indiana. It produced personalities like Mrs. Maddie Miller, who was one of the outstanding principals here, and so. I think people need to understand that influence is here. And so not only has it given us the Rushans and the Millers, but the Tuskegee Airmen were right here among us as well. And those individuals flew approximately 1,500 missions during World War II and were successful and were respected by both the enemy and the friend.
Now, going back to the genesis of Tuskegee, it was in 1881. So that's been a long. Civil War's been over a couple of decades, and I know there was frustration. Okay, these blacks have been freed.
Yes, sir.
But Reconstruction didn't go that well, as well as they wanted it to go. And these Booker T said that we need to get an education going, because that's the way to really rise, is to educate the public. And he was the motivator of that. And that tradition continues, of course, at Tuskegee. You said, 3,500 students now?
Yeah, about 3,000 students, yes.
And you've been there and
yes, sir.
And kind of took in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And tell me about that experience, just walking around campus.
You walk around, and especially when you know the rich history,
Mm-hmm.
and then you pause at the grave of Booker T. Washington, and you view the final resting place of people like Dr. George Washington Carver and others, you know that this is a special place where they were forced to make bricks from straw, but they successfully did that.
And this is the Deep South.
Yeah, this is the Deep South.
It's
Yes, sir.
It's
Yes,
just east of Montgomery, is it? Or
Yeah, about I think it's maybe, I want to say an hour or less.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So this is Dixie.
yes.
Definitely Dixie.
I took my grandchildren a few years ago to some of the major civil rights monuments and institutions of higher learning, because I wanted them to see the richness of these institutions. Sometimes we hear about the South and we have a lot of negative perceptions, but they needed to see that there were a lot of positive things that rose from those segregated environments. From that where Tuskegee was a plantation.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And I think the name Tuskegee means like warrior.
Warrior. Yes.
Warrior.
That is correct.
So there's a warrior spirit there
Yes, sir.
on campus.
Progressive warrior spirit. Yeah.
Now, in the film, we learn about the alleged mutiny during wartime, the imprisonment, and the courts martial. Eventually, all those accused are exonerated.
Yes.
And my takeaway from the story is that President Truman, after the death of President Roosevelt, and other top elected officials and military leaders finally realized something had to be done to change the status quo and end racial segregation in the armed forces. But, of course, that didn't happen overnight.
Right.
It's a process.
Yes.
But I think this kind of accelerated the process.
It did.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly did.
Now, a great resource for Black history, of course, is the Evansville African American Museum.
Yes.
Dr. Ashley Jordan, I know, consulted on this project, along with University of Evansville History Department Director, Dr. James McLeod. Great resources there.
Yes.
They know their stuff.
Yes, sir. Well, and Dr. Ashley Jordan has now been succeeded by Corey Miller, who is Maddie Miller's son.
Oh, really?
Who was a graduate of Tuskegee. Talk about full circle.
Oh, that's great. That's
Yeah.
great. Now, being a pastor, any sermon material that you've gleaned from this documentary?
A lot of good material. Great material. That
helps out.
I probably need to give Owen and Mr. Whitty a little more credit, because they filled in some areas in those sermons that I needed filling. Just about perseverance and about really taking some of the bitter experiences of life and persevering, because you're attempting to live a principled life. So you keep on pushing. Yes, segregation existed. Yes, racism existed, but it did not rob these individuals of their belief in the principles and the precepts of the Constitution of the United States. They caught that vision and they followed it, even when they were met with opposition domestically.
Now, some great characters, of course, in the film. We mentioned Buster Hall and General Davis.
Yes, sir. Benjamin Davis, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Benjamin Davis Sr., who was that, and I heard you allude to that earlier,
Right.
First black general in the Army, and then his son, Benjamin Davis Jr. There's a couple of stories there. There was Buddy Andrew Archer, who was assigned to the 302nd Fighter Squadron of 322nd Fighter Group, and he would fly this P-51 Mustang fighter in Italy against the Nazis, and that he and Wendell Pruitt were called the Gruesome Twosome, and would complete a number of attacks on enemy airplanes. And then in 1944, they're noted for shooting down 3 fighter aircrafts in one day. I mean, that kind of heroism and skill and ability. They're fighting for full citizenship in their country, but they did not allow that to rob them of their initiative and their willingness to train and become the best fighters that America ever produced.
And they were up against some experienced pilots in the German military, the Luftwaffe.
Yes, sir.
So they were battled some of the pros there in the sky and became aces, definitely.
Yes, sir. And were respected by the Nazis.
That's right.
For their flying skills.
Well, Reverend Brooks, you did a great job narrating this film, and I think people definitely should see it. Thanks for being my guest, and keep up the good work. And tell us more about Black history. We need to learn more about it. Now, earlier we talked to the narrator of the film, Pastor Adrian Brooks of Memorial Baptist Church in Evansville. And there are other contributors to this film we should mention, gentlemen.
Well, as Pastor mentioned, Dr. Jordan and Dr. McLeod reviewed some early copies of the script, and Jennifer Clayball, who's our senior graphic designer, helped take some of these archival documents and turn them into something that we could get into the film. And also we had some archivists around the state who were very helpful to us.
Is there a musical score?
Yeah, and the musical score by Corey Miles, who is a colleague of mine that I know from high school. And so I was able to get in touch with him, and he created a really great piece for the film.
Yeah, it was a great ending.
Well, that's a great collaboration there, definitely. So we talked about being in the congregation at Baptist Memorial Church for that first screening, and that had to be a thrill to get the reaction you received.
It absolutely was. Just as Pastor described, it was a high watermark, and it helped tell us that the film was going in the right direction.
You had another screening at Redeemer Church, was that?
Yeah.
That came about a month later, I guess. We were able to both be there that day, and I think the film was well received there. We had a pretty good Q&A afterwards.
We've been fairly fortunate in having very open crowds, very excited crowds for the film, and so it's a really great experience.
What was the Q&A like? What did they want to know?
Kind of the more about the history, and Stephen obviously wrote it, and he's very well versed on his history, very articulate, knows what he's talking about. And there were a couple filmmaking questions in terms of how the piece came together, and so I guess kind of just that aspect of what goes into a documentary, and then also the further historical elements of it.
Now, Tuskegee Airmen, Indiana becomes an official selection of the Victory International Film Festival in Evansville. And Owen Hollander's film, Never Lose Hope, receives honors as well. And we talked about Never Lose Hope, the interview with local veterans. And the film also shown at the Hoosier Films Annual Festival in Bloomington, Indiana. And I know, Stephen Whitty, you were there. What was the reaction at the festival?
I think it was very strong. There were a lot of films that dealt with different social issues, and I think that Tuskegee fit into that line. And what I took away from that was that maybe film festivals are, they're not absent from society. They're aware of what's going on. And I believe some of the selections are reflecting, a consciousness of the racial and social tensions in the country.
Well, tell me about the Hoosier film industry. Is it alive and well?
I think there's a lot of really great talent that you can find even here in Evansville and in Bloomington and anywhere you go. And Indianapolis, I know especially, is very strong, as you'll have in any city. It's not specifically super strong as you would have in like an LA or a New York or somewhere like that, but it's all about finding people who are just as passionate as you and making those connections to collaborate with them.
I know Georgia is really big on promoting films.
Yeah.
Can we see Indiana doing that as well?
Wouldn't that be great? They've
Yeah.
made some moves with tax credits and so forth. And I've had conversations with filmmakers from LA who have come back here for the Victory Festival and say that they have shot some things here and say it is so much easier, and there's expense to consider as well.
Now, any other collaboration in the works between you guys?
Yeah, so we're finishing a project right now with the local chapter of Red Cross here in Evansville about their new installation, and we conducted some interviews there of workers and kind of what our local branch does and what Red Cross does for the community. And so there's another documentary piece coming out about those interviews and that installation.
Yeah, that's been exciting because Specify Creative has been on the other side of the project creating a historical exhibit for the Red Cross that'll mount in about 6 weeks. So we'll have that as a backdrop, and the film kind of goes into what are the expectations for the exhibit and how it might help influence volunteers, attract volunteers, and help Red Cross continue their valuable mission.
Well, I've had Beth Sweeney on my program, the director of the Red
Yes.
Cross,
Yes.
and we talked about the Clara Barton connection
Oh,
to
that's right.
Evansville.
Yeah,
And,
and she was one of the interviews, and she gave a great testimony over what Red Cross does, and she talked a lot about Clara Barton. I know is a huge inspiration for her, and so Clara Barton does get mentioned quite a few times in the piece.
She says they have some documentation involving Clara Barton.
There's some letters in the archives.
That's
and,
good.
And as a matter of fact, if I can mention this very
Sure.
briefly, it was in 1888, I believe, that Clara Barton made a base of operations in Evansville to launch a flood relief mission. They chartered a packet ship. As a matter of fact, there's a plaque on the Esplanade right across the street that mentions that fact.
Now, tell us about Creative Specify. How long has that operation been?
I think we're in our fourth year, and what I had realized is I had been involved in a number of different, agencies, been corporate side as well, and where I saw my own creativity and my own interests going is I wanted a platform to experience, to get involved with everything I wanted to do, and maybe hadn't had a chance to, interior architecture, graphic design, digital, internet, and filmmaking was kind of a frontier that I had exposure as a youth, and then these other interests took over. So it was meeting Owen and his resources, everything that he brought to the scenario, that it was like, and we get along pretty well. We're able to kind of read each other, and so it's the next adventure, I think.
Now let's watch Tuskegee Airmen in Indiana. The filmmakers are Stephen Whitty and Owen Hollander. The film is narrated by the Reverend Adrian Brooks.
Aviation cadets were being groomed to fly warplanes of a unit which was then a unit in thought only, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. These men were pioneers of a venture so new that you who stand here before me now, after 3 years, may still be considered forerunners in the movement which has given you a place in the fighting men of the sky.
When you hear about the Tuskegee Airmen or see a P-51 fighter plane with its tail painted red, you might think that's the only aircraft they flew. The first black pilots in American military history flew more than single-engine, single-seat fighter planes. Tuskegee pilots also flew twin-engine bombers. These were bigger aircraft with a flight crew of 4 to 6 members. But the bomber crews faced a different battle than the fighter pilots. 4 squadrons of Tuskegee-trained pilots formed the 332nd Fighter Group. They flew P-51 Mustangs to escort bombers and attack ground targets. The squadrons flew from bases in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. The first enemy aircraft claimed by a Tuskegee airman happened on July 2nd, 1943, when a member of the 99th Fighter Squadron downed a Focke-Wulf 190, the most effective Luftwaffe fighter of the war. The pilot was First Lieutenant Charles Blakesley Hall from Brazil, Indiana. Their training started at an airfield near the Tuskegee Institute. Training black civilian pilots began there before the war. The region enjoyed good flying weather much of the time. Another reason for selecting Tuskegee for training was because the area presented a segregated environment. This was in step with the Army's segregated training policies of those times. Daniel Hallman of the Air Force Historical Research Agency wrote that one of Franklin Roosevelt's promises during his campaign for a third term as U.S. president was creating opportunities for black pilots in military aviation. The War Department followed through in 1941, but their training and unit assignments were segregated. He also wrote that white officers were the first commanders of flying units composed of black pilots. The first black officers to command came later. The most famous of them was Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr. He was a West Point graduate and later became the first black general in the Air Force. When Colonel Davis took command, the 99th Fighter Squadron had become part of the 332nd Fighter Group and was based in Italy. The 332nd logged a total of 112 enemy aircraft destroyed. 3 of these were the Germans' jet-powered Me-262, making these Tuskegee Airmen among the few Allied pilots to take their propeller-driven P-51s up against the Luftwaffe's high-performance fighters. The German pilots that took notice of their combat skills, giving them the nickname the Black Birdmen. The pilots of 332nd got another nickname, the Red Tails, because the tails of some of their planes were painted red. By the end of the war in Europe, they flew 1,800 combat missions, consisting of 15,533 sorties. In June 1943, when Colonel Davis assumed command, the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bomber Group were combined into the 477th Composite Group. He was assigned the task untangling the problems facing the 477th, problems that began from the day the Bomber Group was activated. Understanding how they came to be starts and ends with the tensions around policies of segregation. Those tensions reached a breaking point when the Bomber Group was stationed in Indiana. The Army Air Force organized a bomber unit in mid-1943 called the 477th Bombardment Group. This group consisted of black flight crews and ground support teams. They were assigned the B-25, a twin-engine, medium-weight bomber. Designed by North American Aviation, over 9,800 B-25s were built for World War II duty. The aircraft is perhaps best known for the Doolittle raid on Japan. The raid happened in April of 1942, when 16 B-25s launched from the Hornet aircraft carrier. The B-25 endeared herself to flight crews for her safe, forgiving handling in the air and her sturdy build. The aircraft could take a tremendous beating and keep flying, even with one engine out. What crews complained about was the high noise level inside the plane. The B-25 was so hard on the ears of its pilots that many suffered some hearing loss. Despite the flight crews of the 477th Bombardment Group having an airplane to meet their combat needs, they never got the chance to fly in any combat theater. Reports published about the 477th mentioned the indifference of the group's white officers who used their postings for moving to higher ranks. Consequently, one report said the 477th represented segregation at its worst. The 477th moved from airbase to airbase, never receiving enough classroom time for training the flight crews, splitting squadrons among different airfields. For example, they were moved from MacDill Field in Florida to Godman Field in Kentucky, then 2 airfields in Indiana, Freeman Field near Seymour and Atterbury Field near Columbus. The reason for 2 fields was that Freeman had the facilities for housing the unit, but its ramps and runways were too small for the B-25 bombers they flew. The unit's aircraft were based at Atterbury. They were in the Hoosier State for a single month, but it was long enough to make history. What became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny symbolized unit commander Colonel Robert Selway's disregard of the War Department's regulations forbidding segregation of public spaces. That included Freeman Field's Officers Club. It was here the officers of the 477th took a stand. Faced with separate and unequal facilities, the officers presented themselves at the White Officers Club on April 5th, 1945. They were denied entry but brushed past the white officer on duty to get inside the club. A publication issued by the National Park Service in 2016 said that over 60 officers of the 477th were arrested the next night for attempting to enter the white officers' club. In response, Colonel Selway issued an order assigning officers to clubs by race. He went further to include segregation of housing and dining halls. He then demanded black officers sign statements agreeing to the order. Over 100 officers of the 477th refused to sign the statement, amounting to a refusal to obey an order from a superior officer. In time of war, it was an offense punishable by death. These officers were placed under arrest, transferred back to Godman Field in Kentucky, and held under armed guard. Godman Field also held German prisoners of war. Just as the Germans had noticed the flying skills of the Red Tails over Europe, they noticed the treatment these officers received in their own country. The German officers of war were quick to ask, "Why are you fighting for a country that doesn't want you?" Testimonials from black service members in World War II convey their understanding of a double consciousness, that is, the duty to serve their country, while knowing their service would not provide them with full access to society back home due to Jim Crow segregation. The Double V campaign, which meant victory at home and abroad, promoted the fight for democracy overseas and at home for black veterans returning from the war. News of Selway's orders, the arrest of officers from the 477th, and subsequent charges spread through the press, labor unions, and Congress. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall eventually ordered the release of the officers, but this wasn't the end. Colonel Selway lost his command and was replaced by Colonel Benjamin Davis. The Army brass judged him as the right man to lead a force that combined the fighter and bomber groups into the 477th Composite Group. In late May 1945, Army Air Force Commanding General Henry Arnold replaced the white officer group over the 477th with black officers commanded by Colonel Davis. Plans were made to send the B-25 group and the fighters at Godman Field to the Pacific to fight the war against Japan. But the war in the Pacific ended before they could deploy. It took until 1995 for removal of letters of reprimand placed in the personnel files of some officers, following the charges being dropped in their cases. Others were removed upon request, and a pardon issued for one officer whose case went to trial. The Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007 in recognition of their unique military record, which inspired revolutionary reform in the armed forces. In the end, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen has many chapters, with only two described here. First, the fighter group, who flew into history as the Red Tails. They were fierce defenders of Allied bombers against enemy aircraft and potent destroyers of enemy ground positions. Second, the bomber groups, who waged a successful battle against racial indifference and segregation. The Tuskegee Airmen overcame the harshness of racism in the military by exhibiting bravery and courage during times of great peril. Their actions gained them the respect of military and political leadership and their fellow service members. Air Force historian Daniel Hallman summed up their contributions this way: the Tuskegee Airmen fought two enemies, the Nazis overseas and racism at home, and truly fought so that others would be free.
You guys are still at it. We're going to see more works from Owen Hollander and Stephen Whitty. Let's hope so. And you guys have really put together a great film, Tuskegee Airmen of Indiana, and hopefully more great stories to tell as well. Thanks for being my guest, guys.
Thank you very
for having
much.
us.
I'm David James, and this is 2 Main Street.